Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to today's presentation, which is titled Coping with Grief. My name is Ali Reza Hassan Ali, and I'm a school social worker with Jaffrey Support Services, and I'll be leading you through this presentation in which we touch base on the topic of grief and how to cope with it. Today is Sunday, November 5th, 2023, and as all of you are sitting here in the Madressah space, we'll be covering the following topics. We'll start with an introduction into grief, understanding grief, and the grieving process. We'll then move into Islamic perspectives on grief and how we can use various coping strategies in order to manage our feelings. Finally, we'll move into some tips for volunteers who are working at the madrasa, as well as parts of self-care that we can use to take care of ourselves. Finally, we'll end with a conclusion for today's presentation. Inna Allaha wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Surely we belong to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and indeed to Him we shall return. This presentation is in response to the loss of Marhum Sayyid Asad Muhammad Jafri, a scholar, a community leader, and a prominent presence in our communities. Let's begin by reciting a Surah Fatiha for Marhum Jafri and all of our Marhumin. Al-Fatiha. To begin understanding grief, we must look at it from the perspective of a definition. Grief is actually a natural response to loss, and loss can range from a loss of person, a loss of a relationship, a loss of a family member, a friend, a job, an item, anything really. Grief can exist as a response to any form of loss. And importantly, it's a complex emotional process that includes a variety of feelings. And as such, there's no real one-size-fits-all approach to coping with grief. And so individuals may feel sadness, anger, guilt, worry, and even relief at the loss of an individual, person, object, or situation. Moving into understanding our stages of grief, we will look at the Kubler-Ross model. And this is one model of understanding grief and how an individual may progress through it. But this is not the only model. And so if this does not fit with you, that's okay. To understand grief, we must begin by understanding that the stages I will present are not linear, as in we don't have to go from one to the next in a particular order. In fact, individuals often fluctuate between different stages of grief. And so, for example, an individual may start off at a particular stage, jump to another one, and then come back to that original stage. And as such, we look at this as just potential stages that an individual might go through. The stages that we'll be reviewing are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. To start off, we'll look at denial, and this is often a very protective stage of grief, in which an individual denies the loss that has happened. A person may say that they cannot believe this has happened, or that there is no way that this occurred. And these phrases and this perspective allows the individual to protect themselves from the pain that is experienced during grief. The next stage is anger. Anger is often directed either at a particular person, themselves, or even God. And so the experience of anger really varies and can differ on an individual basis. For some, after a loss, an individual may direct anger at the person who was lost. They may direct their anger towards themselves, wishing that they had spent more time with the person who was lost. These are all normal reactions. And so it is important to recognize that if an individual is feeling angry, to allow them to have the space to be able to process that and recognize that they are doing their best to manage how they're feeling. Next, we move to the stage of bargaining. This is a stage that does not always happen, but is essentially a stage in which an individual who has experienced loss will begin to bargain with a higher power, in this case, God. Bargaining may look something like, I will pray additional prayers or recite additional amounts of Quran in order to have a person return to me after they've been lost. Another example might be to bargain with God to have them suffer less during the afterlife. There are many examples of different ways that an individual may attempt to bargain as they begin to understand that the person has moved on from this world. Next, we move into the stage of depression, and this is often the stage that feels the most lifeless. An individual may experience a lack of energy, difficulty sleeping, difficulty eating, and so during this time, it is important for those around them to be able to give them the space to recover energy, as well as to be able to provide them with compassion and fun activities in order to be able to move out of this stage. Finally, we move into acceptance. And acceptance does not mean that the pain has disappeared or that grief has gone away. In fact, it is a recognition that a loss has occurred and that the pain exists, but we begin to return to the reality of the situation and begin to engage in the world around us. That's not to say that the pain will go away or that you will continue to remain in acceptance for the rest of time. Rather, it's likely that you could return to other stages and come back to acceptance at a later time. With regards to Islam and grief, there are many things that Islam portrays, and so I won't belabor this point too much. What's important to note is that Islam holds the perspective that death is viewed as a transition to the afterlife and not an endpoint. And as such, this gives us an opportunity to cope with loss. One of the ways that we can do this that's been recommended is to provide gifts for the deceased. And some of the examples that we may have include visiting the graves, reciting du'as in Quran, donating to charity on the behalf of the deceased, or to engage in istighfar for ourselves and for all those that have been lost. Speaking of coping strategies, this is perhaps the primary point that I want to present during this presentation. During grief, we look for coping strategies in order to survive our days as we begin to process the loss that has occurred. And coping strategies exist in both individual components as well as community ones. And so as I speak about these various coping strategies, consider how that you may cope on an individual level and where you may look to your community in order to seek support. The first example of an individual coping strategy that you can engage in is healthy distraction. And this means to be able to engage in activities that take your mind off of what has happened. Now, it's important to note the difference between healthy distraction versus unhealthy distraction. An example of a healthy distraction might be to watch a comedic show on TV. And this, if spent within a reasonable amount of time, is considered healthy. However, if you were to spend all day and all night watching TV shows without engaging in any sleep, eating any meals, then you've begun to move into a stage where distraction may not be as healthy. The second individual coping strategy we have is mindfulness and relaxation. And it's important to note here with regards to relaxation that there are different ways to engage in this. For example, for some people, relaxation can look like taking a walk in which they look outside, look at the trees, listen to the birds, and are able to ground themselves in the present moment. For others, this can look like taking a bath. For others, this might be reciting Quran on their own. There are a variety of different ways to relax and engage in mindfulness, and so be creative when you're doing so. Next, and arguably one of the most important coping strategies, is to maintain routine. Grief is an emotion and a response that can hit you completely out of the blue. On some days, an individual who's experiencing grief may feel like they're doing completely okay, only to have a particular event occur that in them being hit with grief with a level of intensity that they were not expecting. And so with this, it's important to consider maintaining your routine. Whatever you typically would do on a day-to-day basis, continue to do so that you can lean on your routine in order to be able to manage when grief does hit you. Number 4 is patience and self-compassion. As I mentioned, grief is an emotion and a response that comes through without any warning. And so when it does hit and it does disrupt a person's day, take the time to be patient with them and perhaps consider encouraging self-compassion so that they do not feel guilty for feeling grief. Next, we'll move into the community supports. And alhamdulillah, being at the madrasa, this is a great place to find some of these community strategies. The first one is to seek support. And this means you can reach out to a professional, such as like myself, or you can reach out to your fellow staff, volunteers, and even your students to let them know that you're struggling with grief. You may begin to ask them for ways that they are managing, and also be able to check in on other people to see how they're doing. The second is honoring memories. Honoring the memories of the person that was lost allows for the community to grieve together and be able to hold on to the important parts of the life that was lost. If there are any components of the person's life that are important, consider putting that into your own life to be able to carry their memory forward. Number 3 is prayer. Engaging in prayer together has a variety of spiritual, psychological, and emotional benefits. And so while I don't have to explain this to you in too much depth, consider going to Jamaat Salat as a way to cope with grief. Number 4 is charity, and to do so in the name of the person who was lost. This can really allow for the community to come together to accomplish a particular task that has meaning and value in the world around you. Next, we'll move on to tips for volunteers supporting youth. And this is all of you. All of you spend countless hours volunteering to support the youth in this community. And so it's important for you to consider how your actions may influence the youth around you who are also grieving. In order to help the people around you, consider using the following skills. First of all, active listening. Be sure to listen carefully to what children and youth are saying and recognize that they may not have the most amount of words to use to describe how they're feeling. And so you may ask some further exploratory questions, or even consider repeating back what they've said to you in order to make sure you've understood them correctly. Number 2 is encouraging self-care. Grief is a response that can often disrupt the way we're feeling and the way we engage on a day-to-day basis. And so if you find your students or the youth around you to be off with their mood or perhaps not engaging in class, consider offering them opportunities to engage in self-care, whether that be eating a snack, drinking some water, or going to use the bathroom. Number 3 is to promote meaningful activities. And obviously at a madrasa, there are a variety of these. And so you may begin to look at engaging in reciting Quran for the person who was lost, or perhaps dua. Whatever feels meaningful to you in the moment, be sure to promote these meaningful activities as a way to respond to grief. Lastly, and I'll repeat this point again for the youth, supporting daily tasks and routine. Again, grief can come out of nowhere. And so having a routine allows us to be able to protect ourselves for when this happens. The last point I want to put forward is self-care for yourselves. Coping with grief can be emotionally challenging, and so be sure to take some breaks, support the peers around you, and reach out for help if you need it. If you'd like to reach out to me directly, please email support@alhaadi.ca to set up an appointment so that we can chat. And with that, thank you very much and wassalam.